Tonight, you are about to begin a long, quiet journey through time, memory, and place. This is not a story meant to be rushed, and it is not a history lesson that asks you to stay alert or focused. Instead, this is a gentle unfolding of the past, a slow, steady narration designed to help your mind soften, your thoughts slow, and your body relax as the story moves forward without urgency. What you are listening to is a documentary sleep story. It is created to be experienced calmly, whether you are listening closely or drifting in and out of sleep. The pacing is intentional. The tone is even and unhurried. There is no pressure to remember dates, names, or details. If your attention wanders, that is perfectly fine. This story is meant to accompany rest, not demand effort. Tonight's journey explores the long and layered history of a city shaped by land, water, movement, and change. A place that grew from quiet beginnings into something vast and complex, carrying traces of every era it passed through. A city formed by natural landscapes, indigenous life, settlement, struggle, growth, industry, and ongoing transformation. That city is Houston. This video is titled The Entire History of Houston, Sleep Story and Documentary, and the title Isiki is used intentionally. What you're about to hear is not a summary and not a highlight reel. It is a complete, continuous story told slowly, allowing space between moments. The goal is not to rush from one event to the next, but to let history unfold naturally, in a way that feels calm and immersive rather than overwhelming. As the story begins, you will be guided back to a time long before modern Houston existed, before streets, buildings, or borders. You will hear about the natural landscape that shaped early life, about the people who lived on this land first, about exploration and settlement, and about how small decisions slowly led to large changes over time. The journey will move through slavery, war, recovery, trade, oil, industry, space exploration, and modern cultural growth, always at a pace that respects rest rather than urgency. This story is not built on tension. It does not rely on drama or sudden shifts. Instead, it focuses on atmosphere, daily life, and the steady rhythm of time passing. History here becomes something gentle, something that moves beside you quietly, rather than something that asks for your full attention. The narration you will hear is intentionally slow, smooth, and even. It is designed for long listening sessions, quiet evenings, late nights, and moments when your mind needs calm rather than stimulation. You may listen actively, following each sentence as it unfolds, or you may allow the voice to fade gently into the background as your body relaxes. There is no correct way to listen. There is only a calm way. If sleep arrives before the story reaches its end, that is not a mistake. That is the intention. These stories are designed to continue even if you drift away, creating a sense of comfort and continuity rather than completion. This video is part of the Path to Sleep channel, a space created for those who enjoy history told softly, without noise, without urgency, and without stress. Here, the past is not something to rush through or analyze deeply. It is something to move through slowly, like a long walk through familiar landscapes at dusk. These stories are meant to be companions during quiet hours, helping you unwind after long days and guiding you gently toward rest. If you find comfort in this kind of storytelling, you are warmly invited to support the channel. A simple like helps more people discover these calm history journeys. Subscribing allows you to return whenever you need relaxation, comfort, or sleep. And if you feel like sharing your thoughts, leaving a comment is always welcome, whether you stayed awake through the entire story or drifted off somewhere along the way. As this journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your position if needed. Lower the volume to a comfortable level. Let your shoulders relax. Allow your breathing to slow naturally. There is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to go. This story does not require effort. It asks only that you allow it to unfold. As the history of Houston moves gently forward, let the present moment soften around you. Let the past become a quiet background, and let rest arrive whenever it chooses. Thank you for spending this peaceful time with Past to Sleep. Sweet dreams and enjoy the journey. Number 1. The ancient natural landscape of the Gulf Coast, long before the name Houston existed, long before roads, buildings, or human boundaries shaped the land. The region along the upper Gulf Coast rested in a state of quiet natural balance. Time here did not move with urgency. It flowed slowly, guided by water, wind, soil, and sunlight. This land did not belong to history yet. It belonged only to nature and to the steady rhythm of the earth itself. The foundation of this region was shaped over immense stretches of time by powerful geological forces. The land that would one day support Houston formed gradually as sediments carried by rivers settled along the coastal plain. These layers built upon one another patiently, creating flat expanses, gentle rises, and fertile lowlands. There were no towering mountains here, but the land held a different strength, one of openness, softness, and adaptability. Rivers played a central role in shaping this ancient landscape. Long before they were named, waterways like Buffalo Bayou, the Brazos River, and the San Jacinto River flowed quietly across the land. These rivers did not rush. They curved and wandered, responding to rainfall, gravity, and the subtle slope of the earth. Over time, they carved channels, created wetlands, and nourished wide floodplains that refreshed themselves season after season. Water moved everywhere in this region. Rain fell regularly, feeding creeks and bayous that spread gently through the land. During wetter seasons, water expanded outward, flooding low areas and depositing rich sediment. When waters receded, the land was left fertile and renewed. This cycle repeated endlessly, teaching the land how to absorb change without breaking. To the south and east, the land opened toward the Gulf of Mexico. Coastal marshes, estuaries, and shallow bays formed where freshwater met saltwater. These areas were never fixed. Tides rose and fell daily, storms reshaped shorelines. Sediment shifted slowly, creating new wetlands while others faded back into the sea. The coastline lived and breathed, constantly adjusting. The climate of this ancient Gulf Coast region was warm and humid for much of the year. Summers were long, filled with sunlight and moisture that encouraged rapid plant growth. Winters were mild, rarely halting life completely. Seasonal storms arrived at times, bringing heavy rain and strong winds, yet even these events became part of the land's long memory rather than moments of destruction. Plant life adapted beautifully to these conditions. Vast grasslands spread across open areas, nourished by rainfall and fertile soil. Dense forests grew along rivers and bayous, filled with hardwood trees, tall pines, and thick undergrowth. Oaks, cypress, and other water-loving trees anchored themselves near slow-moving waters, their roots gripping the soft earth and preventing erosion. Wetlands became one of the defining features of this region. Marshes, swamps, and floodplains supported rich ecosystems filled with subtle movement. Reeds and grasses swayed gently in the breeze. Trees rose from shallow water, their reflections trembling softly beneath them. These wetlands filtered water naturally, slowed floods, and created safe habitats for countless forms of life. Animal life moved through this landscape with quiet awareness. Large animals followed the availability of water and vegetation, traveling across open plains and forest edges. Smaller creatures lived among grasses, beneath roots, and within the shelter of wetlands. Birds filled the sky seasonally, arriving and departing along migration routes that repeated year after year with remarkable consistency. Sound in this ancient land was calm and layered. Wind moved across tall grass. Water flowed softly through bayous. Insects hummed gently in warm air. Bird calls echoed briefly, then faded back into silence. There was no constant noise, no interruption. Silence here was full, not empty, alive with subtle motion. Light shaped the rhythm of life. Sunrises arrived slowly over flat horizons, casting warm colors across wetlands and open land. Sunsets lingered, stretching long shadows across grass and water. Nights were dark and wide, free from artificial light. allowing stars to spread clearly across the sky. These cycles guided rest and activity naturally. The land did not exist to be controlled or improved. It did not anticipate human arrival. Rivers flowed where gravity guided them. Wetlands expanded where water lingered. Storms arrived and passed. Everything followed its own internal rhythm, shaped by natural law rather than intention. Over thousands of years, this landscape remained resilient. It bent with floods instead of resisting them. It absorbed storms instead of shattering. Change was constant but gentle. The land learned how to renew itself endlessly, preparing, without knowing it, for the lives that would one day settle along its waters. As you imagine this earliest chapter of Houston's story, picture wide skies above quiet wetlands. Feel warm air resting gently over slow-moving water. Hear only wind, insects, and distant birds. Let your thoughts slow to match the pace of the land itself. This was the ancient natural world of the Houston region, unclaimed, unhurried, and whole, resting peacefully as time moved forward, waiting quietly for the first human footsteps to arrive. As time continued its slow and patient movement across the Gulf Coast, the land that would one day support Houston deepened into a state of quiet continuity. Nothing here rushed forward, nothing resisted change. The environment learned how to adapt gently, allowing each element, water, soil, air, and life, to exist in balance with the others. This was a landscape shaped not by sudden transformation, but by endless repetition and subtle adjustment. The rivers of the region continued their calm, wandering paths. Bayous stretched like quiet veins across the land, connecting wetlands, forests, and open plains. These waterways shifted slightly over centuries, responding to rainfall and sediment rather than force. During heavy rains, water spilled gently over their banks, spreading across lowlands and refreshing the soil. When waters withdrew, they left behind nourishment that supported thick growth and renewed life. Flooding here was not destructive in the ancient world. It was expected, understood, and absorbed. The land was shaped to accept water rather than fight it. Soft soil, wide floodplains, and wetlands allowed excess water to spread and slow naturally. This rhythm prevented erosion and maintained fertility, ensuring that life could continue without exhaustion. Wetlands expanded and contracted with the seasons. Marsh grasses grew tall in warm months, their roots holding soil in place while filtering water. Cypress trees rose slowly from shallow pools, their trunks sturdy and patient, their roots spreading wide beneath the surface. These wetlands acted as quiet guardians of balance, protecting inland areas from storms and absorbing changes brought by tides and rain. Along the coast, the relationship between land and sea remained fluid. Tides advanced and retreated daily, reshaping shorelines grain by grain. Storms occasionally pushed water inland, altering marshes and estuaries. Yet even these events did not disrupt the land permanently. Over time, sediments settled, plants returned, and balance was restored. The coastline evolved continuously without losing its identity. The climate supported steady growth. Warm temperatures encouraged plant life year-round, while seasonal variations provided periods of rest. Rainfall arrived frequently, nourishing forests and grasslands alike. Even during drier stretches, the land retained moisture through its wetlands and waterways. Life here was rarely halted completely. It slowed, adjusted, and continued. Forests grew denser along rivers and bayous. Trees leaned gently toward water, their roots stabilizing the banks. Understory plants filled shaded spaces, creating layered ecosystems rich with life. These forests were alive with subtle motion, leaves shifting, insects moving, birds nesting quietly among branches. Growth occurred patiently, guided by sunlight, water, and time. Grasslands stretched across open areas where forests gave way. These spaces supported grazing animals and allowed wind to move freely across the land. Fire occasionally passed through these grasslands, sparked naturally by lightning. These fires were not destructive forces. They cleared old growth, returned nutrients to the soil, and encouraged new life to emerge. Fire became another quiet tool of renewal. Animal life adapted continuously to these changing conditions. Large animals moved with the seasons, guided by instinct and memory. Smaller creatures found shelter in wetlands, forests, and grasslands, adjusting behavior rather than migrating long distances. Birds arrived and departed in familiar patterns, filling the air briefly with sound before returning to silence. Predator and prey existed in careful balance. No species overwhelmed the land. Population changes occurred gradually, regulated by available food and habitat rather than sudden collapse. This balance ensured long-term stability, allowing ecosystems to remain resilient across countless generations. Sound remained gentle and meaningful. Wind passed through reeds and trees. Water flowed steadily through bayous. Insects hummed softly in warm air. Occasional animal calls echoed briefly before dissolving into the quiet background. Silence here was never empty. It was layered with awareness and subtle movement. Light continued to shape daily rhythm without interruption. Long summer days allowed extended activity and growth. Shorter winter days encouraged rest and conservation. Dawn and dusk arrived slowly without artificial boundaries. Night brought deep darkness filled with stars, unbroken by human presence. The soil of the region grew richer with time. Layers of organic matter accumulated as plants lived, died, and returned to the earth. This soil held moisture effectively, supporting life even during dry periods. Roots spread wide and deep, preventing erosion and anchoring the land firmly in place. Storms occasionally arrived from the Gulf, bringing strong winds and heavy rain. Yet even these powerful events became part of the land's long rhythm. Trees bent rather than broke. Wetlands absorbed excess water. After storms passed, life returned quietly, often stronger than before. Resilience here was not resistance. It was flexibility. Despite constant movement, the landscape retained harmony. Rivers did not overwhelm forests. Wetlands did not erase grasslands. Each element existed in relationship with the others, adjusting gently when needed. The land functioned as a unified system rather than a collection of separate parts. There were no borders here, no ownership. Space belonged to movement, season, and time. Paths formed where animals traveled repeatedly, then faded when routes changed. Nothing was fixed permanently. Everything remained responsive. Memory existed only in form and pattern, in riverbends shaped by centuries of flow, in soil layers built slowly over time, in wetlands expanding and retreating with seasons. The land remembered itself without words. As thousands of years passed, this ancient Gulf Coast landscape remained stable in spirit. It adapted continuously without urgency. It existed fully in each moment, unaware of names, maps, or future cities. It carried the past gently and allowed the future to approach slowly. As you imagine this stage of the land's story, picture warm air resting over quiet water. See reeds swaying softly in wetlands. Feel the calm of a place that does not hurry and does not resist. This was the Houston region continuing its ancient life, patient, flexible, and enduring. A land shaped by water and time, resting peacefully as centuries passed, preparing, without knowing it, for the arrival of human presence still far beyond the horizon. As the long arc of time continued its gentle movement, the ancient Gulf Coast landscape settled into a deep and enduring rhythm. This was a land that no longer needed to change dramatically in order to survive. It had already learned how to live with water, heat, storms, and quiet renewal. Everything here moved with a kind of calm confidence, shaped by countless cycles that repeated without urgency. The bayous became the most defining feature of this region's identity. They flowed slowly and deliberately, never straight, always responsive to the land around them. Their banks softened over time, shaped by gentle erosion rather than force. Water levels rose and fell with the seasons, expanding during heavy rains and retreating during drier months. Each movement refreshed the land rather than exhausting it. Floodplains remained wide and open, designed by nature itself to receive water without damage. When rivers overflowed, they spread calmly across the land, leaving behind nutrient-rich sediment. This process nourished grasses, trees, and wetlands, ensuring that growth returned quickly and evenly. Nothing was wasted, nothing was rushed. The wetlands continued to serve as quiet guardians of balance. Marshes filtered water, slowed storms, and created safe spaces for life to thrive. Tall grasses swayed gently in the breeze. Shallow pools reflected the sky. Cypress trees stood patiently, their roots rising from the water like quiet anchors. These wetlands changed subtly from season to season, yet their purpose remained constant. The coastline continued its slow conversation with the Gulf of Mexico. Tides arrived and departed with dependable rhythm. Storm surges occasionally pushed inland, reshaping marsh edges and estuaries. Over time, sediment settled and plant life returned, restoring balance. The shoreline was never fixed, yet it was never lost. It evolved continuously, guided by water and gravity. The climate reinforced steadiness rather than extremes. Warmth encouraged growth across much of the year. Mild winters rarely stopped life completely. Even during cooler periods, the land rested rather than retreated. Rainfall arrived frequently enough to sustain forests, grasslands, and wetlands without exhausting them. Life here learned how to continue without pause. Forests matured quietly along waterways and lowlands. Trees grew tall and strong, their roots spreading wide to hold soil in place. Fallen leaves returned nutrients to the ground. When storms brought down branches or entire trees, sunlight reached the forest floor, allowing new growth to emerge. Renewal happened naturally, without intervention. Grasslands remained open and resilient. Grazing animals moved through these spaces, shaping vegetation gently rather than consuming it entirely. Fire passed through occasionally, sparked by lightning, clearing old growth and allowing fresh life to rise. These fires were brief and patchy, never overwhelming the land. Afterward, grasses returned quickly, stronger and more diverse than before. Animal life continued to exist in careful balance. Large animals followed familiar routes shaped by water and vegetation. Smaller creatures adapted to shelter within wetlands and forests. Birds traveled along long migration paths, arriving and departing with remarkable consistency. No species dominated, no species disappeared suddenly. Balance governed survival. Predators and prey existed in quiet relationship. Population shifts occurred gradually, guided by food availability rather than conflict. This natural regulation prevented extremes and ensured long-term stability. Life here did not thrive through competition alone, but through adaptation and restraint. Sound remained soft and comforting. Wind moved gently across grass and water. Insects filled warm air with a low, steady hum. Birds called briefly before settling again into silence. Water flowed slowly, its movement steady and unbroken. There was no constant noise, only layered calm. Light continued to guide life without interruption. Sunrises spread slowly across flat horizons. Sunsets lingered, painting wetlands and open land in warm tones. Nights were deep and dark, filled with stars unobstructed by artificial light. These cycles encouraged rest as much as activity, reinforcing balance through repetition. The soil deepened with each passing century. Organic matter accumulated slowly, holding moisture and nutrients. Roots stabilized the land, preventing erosion even during heavy rain. The ground itself became a living system, absorbing water gently and releasing it gradually into streams and bayous. Storms from the Gulf arrived from time to time, bringing strong winds and heavy rain. Yet even these powerful events became part of the land's rhythm. Wetlands absorbed excess water. Forests bent rather than broke. After storms passed, life resumed quietly. Recovery here was not dramatic, it was expected. Despite constant motion, the landscape remained unified. Water did not overwhelm land. Growth did not exhaust soil. Each element existed in relationship with the others, adjusting naturally when conditions shifted. The system held together not through control, but through cooperation. There were still no boundaries, no ownership, no paths fixed forever. Space belonged to movement, season and time. Routes formed where animals traveled repeatedly, then faded when patterns changed. The land remained open and responsive. Memory existed only in shape and form, in the curve of a bayou, in layers of sediment beneath wetlands, in the spread of forests along rivers. The land remembered itself without words, carrying its past quietly into the present. As thousands of years passed, the ancient Gulf Coast landscape remained calm and complete. It did not anticipate change, it did not resist it. It simply existed, shaped by water, soil and sky, resting in balance. As you imagine this final stage of the ancient natural world near Houston, picture wide skies over still wetlands. Feel warm air resting gently over slow-moving water. Hear only wind, insects and distant birds. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of the land. This was the land before history, before settlement, before names and borders. A landscape shaped by patience rather than ambition, flexible rather than rigid, enduring rather than hurried. The ancient Gulf Coast rested quietly in its balance, carrying centuries within it, unaware that human footsteps would one day arrive and that a new chapter would slowly begin. Number 2, early indigenous peoples and life before settlement. As the ancient natural landscape of the Gulf Coast continued its calm and balanced rhythm, human presence entered the region slowly and gently. This arrival did not disrupt the land, it blended into it. The first people who lived in the area that would one day become Houston did not come with plans to reshape the environment. They came to live within it, guided by observation, patience, and respect for the rhythms already in place. These early indigenous peoples arrived over long stretches of time, likely following natural pathways shaped by rivers, coastlines, and changing climate. Movement was never hurried. Groups traveled gradually, guided by the availability of food, fresh water, and shelter. When the land provided, they stayed. When conditions shifted, they moved on. This flexibility became central to survival and to harmony with the environment. The land offered abundance, but only to those who learned how to listen. Rivers and bayous provided fresh water and fish. Wetlands offered birds, small animals, and plant life. Forests supplied wood, shelter, and game. Open grassland supported grazing animals. Nothing was taken without awareness. Nothing was wasted. Survival depended on balance rather than excess. Daily life followed the seasons closely. Spring brought renewal as plant life emerged and animals became more active. Summer offered long days for gathering, fishing, and travel. Autumn encouraged preparation as food was preserved and shelters were strengthened. Winter slowed movement and required careful conservation of resources. Each season had a purpose. None was resisted. Food gathering required patience and skill. Hunting followed animal behavior rather than force. Hunters learned migration patterns, feeding habits, and timing. Fishing was guided by seasonal return, especially in rivers and coastal waters. Plants were gathered carefully, roots, berries, seeds, and edible greens, never stripping an area completely. This ensured that resources returned year after year. Fire played a controlled and respectful role in daily life. Small fires provided warmth, light, and a place to prepare food. Fire was also used carefully to manage land, clearing small areas and encouraging new growth without damaging surrounding ecosystems. This practice mirrored the natural fires already familiar to the land, reinforcing renewal rather than destruction. Shelter reflected adaptability rather than permanence. Homes were built from materials readily available: wood, reeds, grass, and earth. Structures were designed to protect from heat, rain, and occasional cold without dominating the landscape. Some shelters were temporary, used seasonally. Others lasted longer, repaired and maintained as needed. When groups moved, the land was allowed to recover naturally. Clothing was shaped by environment and necessity. Animal hides and plant fibers provided protection from heat, insects, and occasional cold. Designs emphasized comfort, movement, and durability rather than decoration alone. Over time, Techniques improved through experience, passed down through observation and practice rather than written instruction. Community life was deeply cooperative. Survival depended on shared effort rather than individual achievement. Tasks were divided naturally, guided by age, ability, and season. Elders carried knowledge gained through experience. Children learned by watching and participating gradually. Everyone contributed in ways that maintained balance within the group. Learning was woven into daily life. Skills were not taught through formal lessons, but through repetition and example. Children learned how to fish by watching adults prepare nets and lines. They learned how to gather plants by walking alongside elders. Knowledge grew slowly, rooted in experience rather than urgency. Spiritual life was inseparable from daily existence. The natural world was not viewed as separate from people. Rivers, animals, weather, and land were understood as living forces deserving respect. Gratitude was expressed through ritual, restraint, and care. Life was not owned, it was shared. Movement across the land followed natural routes. Rivers served as pathways, allowing travel deep into the region. Bayous connected wetlands and forests. Trails formed where footsteps repeated over time, then faded when routes changed. There were no permanent roads, no fixed boundaries. Space remained fluid and responsive. Time was not measured in numbers, it was felt through seasons, events, and memory. Years were remembered by significant floods, abundant harvests, or difficult winters. This way of understanding time kept life grounded in the present while honoring the past. Trade developed quietly between neighboring groups. Tools, materials, food, and knowledge moved along rivers and trails. Trade strengthened relationships rather than encouraging accumulation. Exchange was based on trust and reciprocity, not profit or expansion. Conflict was limited and generally resolved through tradition and dialogue. Resources were managed through shared understanding, reducing competition. Balance mattered more than dominance. Stability mattered more than control. Health and healing were approached holistically. Physical well-being was inseparable from emotional and spiritual balance. Knowledge of medicinal plants was passed down carefully, refined through observation and experience. Healing involved community support as much as technique. Illness was not faced alone. Sound in this world remained gentle. Conversation was calm. Activity followed need rather than schedule. Silence was familiar and comfortable, allowing awareness to remain wide. The land itself remained the loudest presence, wind, water, and life moving softly together. As generations passed, indigenous life in the Houston region became deeply rooted and resilient. Cultures adapted subtly to the environment, refining practices that ensured continuity. Change occurred slowly, absorbed rather than resisted. The land and its people shaped one another through long relationship. As you imagine this earliest chapter of human life near Houston, picture small communities moving calmly along bayous, canoes gliding across still water, fires glowing softly at dusk, voices low and steady, the land vast and patient around them. This was not conquest, not expansion, but belonging. Human life entered the Gulf Coast gently, learning to listen before acting, to adapt before changing, and to live in harmony with a land already complete, setting the foundation for cultures that would endure for centuries, long before settlement and history would begin to reshape the region. As time continued its gentle movement across the Gulf Coast, indigenous life in the region deepened into a state of quiet stability. Generations lived and passed, each one adding experience rather than disruption. Knowledge was not something to be discovered suddenly. It was something carried carefully, refined slowly, and passed forward through memory, routine, and shared living. Communities became deeply attuned to long-term patterns. Elders remembered cycles that extended far beyond a single lifetime. Years of abundant rain, seasons of drought, periods when rivers rose higher than usual, and times when food required careful conservation. These memories shaped decisions, guiding when to travel, when to remain still, and when to prepare more carefully. Time was not rushed, it was respected. Children grew into responsibility naturally, Learning was never separated from life itself. Young people watched how food was gathered, how shelters were built, and how tools were repaired. Skills were learned through repetition, through watching hands move slowly and deliberately. Mistakes were part of learning, corrected with patience rather than urgency. Confidence grew quietly, rooted in experience. Social bonds strengthened through shared effort. Fishing, hunting, gathering, cooking, and preparation were often communal activities. Working together reduced risk and reinforced trust. No one lived entirely apart from the group. Cooperation was not optional. It was the foundation of survival. Through shared labor, relationships deepened and stability endured. Seasonal movement continued to guide life. Spring brought renewed activity as rivers swelled and plant life returned. Summer allowed extended travel, trade, and gathering. Autumn focused attention inward, preserving food and preparing for cooler months. Winter slowed movement, encouraging reflection, storytelling, and rest. Each season carried meaning. None was rushed, none was feared. The use of land remained careful and intentional. Areas were never exhausted completely. When resources in one place began to thin, communities moved rather than forcing the land to provide more. This flexibility preserved balance and ensured that plants and animals could return naturally. The land was trusted to renew itself if given time. Fishing techniques became increasingly refined. Nets, traps, and lines were crafted with care, designed to work with water flow rather than against it. Fishing followed seasonal patterns, allowing populations to replenish. Rivers and bayous were treated as living systems rather than resources to be drained. Respect ensured continuity. Hunting practices remained guided by restraint. Animals were taken according to need, not excess. Every part of what was taken had purpose. This careful use reinforced gratitude and reduced waste. Over time, these practices ensured that animal populations remained stable rather than depleted. Plant knowledge expanded through generations of observation. Communities learned which plants provided food, medicine, or materials. Harvesting followed careful timing. Plants were gathered selectively, leaving enough to grow again. This approach allowed landscapes to remain productive year after year without degradation. Shelters continued to evolve, adapting subtly to environment and season. Structures were adjusted for airflow during warm months and insulation during cooler periods. Repairs were made using local materials. Homes were not designed to dominate the land, but to exist comfortably within it. When shelters were abandoned, the land reclaimed them gently. Spiritual understanding deepened alongside daily life. The natural world was not divided into sacred and ordinary. Everything belonged to the same living system. Animals were honored for sustaining life. Rivers were respected as pathways and providers. Weather was observed rather than feared. Rituals reinforced gratitude, humility, and balance rather than control. Leadership remained fluid and situational. Individuals with experience guided decisions when needed, then returned to shared life without separation. Authority was earned through wisdom and care, not imposed by force. This approach preserved harmony and prevented rigid hierarchy. Trade networks expanded quietly. Goods, tools, materials, and stories moved between neighboring groups along rivers and trails. Trade strengthened relationships and shared knowledge rather than encouraging accumulation. Exchange was based on trust, reciprocity, and long-standing connection. Language carried deep meaning shaped by environment. Words described subtle changes in water, weather, and land. Stories preserved memory and taught behavior, how to live respectfully, how to prepare, how to respond to change. Oral tradition kept history alive without fixing it rigidly. The past remained flexible, adapting gently to present needs. Conflict remained rare and carefully managed. Disagreements were addressed through dialogue and tradition rather than violence. Balance mattered more than victory. Community stability took precedence over individual desire. Health and healing remained holistic. Physical well-being was inseparable from emotional and spiritual balance. Knowledge of medicinal plants was refined slowly, guided by observation and experience. Healing involved community support as much as technique. Illness was shared, understood, and addressed together. Sound in this world remained calm and layered. Conversation was soft. Activity followed need rather than schedule. Silence was common and comfortable, allowing awareness to remain wide. The land itself continued to provide the dominant rhythm. Wind moving through grasses, water flowing gently, insects humming quietly. Despite occasional hardship, fear did not define life. Preparation and shared knowledge reduced uncertainty. Even during difficult seasons, communities relied on cooperation and memory rather than panic. Hardship was met with patience and endurance. As centuries passed, indigenous life along the Gulf Coast became deeply rooted and resilient. Cultures did not remain unchanged, but they remained balanced. Adaptation occurred without losing identity. The land and its people continued to shape one another through quiet exchange. As you imagine this phase of life near the bayous and wetlands, picture a calm evening beside slow-moving water. Smoke rising gently from cooking fires, soft voices sharing stories, children resting nearby, the land steady and protective around them. This was life shaped by belonging, by memory, by patience. Indigenous peoples of the Houston region created cultures of quiet strength and understanding long before settlement arrived. Their knowledge was not written in books, but carried in movement, story, and care for the land. And as time continued forward, this wisdom endured, rooted deeply in place, ready to adapt once again when new influences would eventually approach the horizon. As time continued to pass across the land that would one day become Houston, indigenous life along the Gulf Coast reached a state of deep continuity. This was not a world driven by urgency or expansion. It was a world shaped by memory, repetition, and quiet understanding. Generations lived, learned it, and passed on knowledge, without disrupting the balance that had sustained life for centuries. The relationship between people and land grew increasingly refined. Communities no longer needed to experiment with survival. They understood the rhythms of water and soil, the timing of seasons, and the movement of animals with quiet confidence. Knowledge lived in daily routine rather than instruction. To wake, to gather, to prepare, to rest, each action followed patterns shaped long ago. Rivers and bayous remained central to life. Their slow movement guided travel, food gathering, and settlement patterns. These waterways were never forced into use. They were followed gently, respected for their unpredictability. When waters rose, people adjusted. When waters receded, life expanded again. Flexibility ensured survival more than strength. Fishing continued to be a reliable source of nourishment. Nets and traps were placed thoughtfully, designed to work with currents rather than against them. Fishing followed careful timing, allowing fish populations to replenish naturally. Certain areas were used only during specific seasons, while others were left untouched for long periods. This restraint preserved abundance without depletion. Hunting followed similar principles. Animals were taken with intention, not excess. The act of hunting was never separated from gratitude. Animals were understood as part of a shared system, not resources to be consumed thoughtlessly. Each successful hunt reinforced responsibility rather than dominance. Plant knowledge expanded steadily. Communities learned to recognize subtle differences in soil, moisture, and sunlight. They understood which plants thrived near water, which preferred higher ground, and which returned year after year if harvested carefully. Roots, berries, seeds, and medicinal plants were gathered with patience. Harvesting never stripped the land bare. Agriculture, where practiced, existed alongside hunting and gathering rather than replacing it. Crops were grown in small plots, tended carefully, and allowed to rest when soil showed signs of exhaustion. Fields were not permanent scars on the land. They were temporary partnerships, abandoned and reclaimed naturally when needed. Seasonal movement remained essential. Communities shifted locations throughout the year, following food sources and climate patterns. This movement prevented overuse of any single area and allowed ecosystems to recover fully. Camps were familiar but not fixed. Places were revisited through memory rather than ownership. Shelters reflected deep environmental understanding. Homes were constructed to allow airflow during hot months and protection during storms. Materials were taken locally and used efficiently. When structures were no longer needed, they were left to return to the land quietly. Nothing here was meant to last forever. Social life remained rooted in cooperation. Work was shared. Food was distributed. Knowledge flowed freely between generations. Elders offered guidance through experience rather than authority. Decisions were made collectively, guided by tradition and consensus rather than force. Children learned not through instruction alone, but through presence. They watched adults prepare food, build tools, and rid the land. Over time, they joined these tasks naturally, learning responsibility without pressure. Confidence developed slowly, grounded in familiarity rather than urgency. Language carried memory and precision. Words described subtle environmental changes, shifts in wind, water behavior, and animal movement. Stories preserved history while teaching behavior. Through storytelling, the past remained alive without becoming rigid. Lessons adapted to present needs while honoring tradition. Spiritual life remained inseparable from daily existence. The land was not divided into sacred and ordinary. Rivers, animals, weather, and soil were all part of the same living system. Rituals reinforced gratitude and balance rather than control. People understood themselves as participants rather than rulers. Health and healing reflected this holistic worldview. Physical illness was understood alongside emotional and spiritual well-being. Healing practices combined plant knowledge with rest, care, and community support. No one faced illness alone. Healing was shared. Trade networks expanded gradually. Goods and materials moved between groups along waterways and trails. Trade strengthened relationships rather than encouraging accumulation. Exchange was based on reciprocity and trust, not profit. These networks also carried information, warnings of storms, changes in animal behavior, and seasonal shifts. Conflict remained rare. When disagreements occurred, they were addressed through dialogue and tradition rather than violence. Maintaining harmony mattered more than winning. Community stability outweighed individual desire. Despite occasional hardship, floods, storms, poor seasons, fear did not dominate life. Preparation, memory, and cooperation reduced uncertainty. Communities trusted their ability to adapt. Hardship was met with patience rather than panic. Sound in this world remained gentle. Conversations were calm. Activity followed need rather than schedule. Silence was familiar and comforting, allowing awareness to remain wide. The dominant sounds were natural. Water moving slowly, wind through grasses, insects humming softly. As centuries passed, indigenous cultures along the Gulf Coast became deeply resilient. They adapted subtly without losing identity. Change occurred slowly, absorbed rather than resisted. The land and its people continued to shape one another through quiet exchange. There was no sense of waiting for something else. Life was complete as it was. The future was not imagined as progress, but as continuation. Change, when it arrived, would be met as change always had been, with observation, patience, and careful adjustment. As you imagine this final phase of early indigenous life near the Houston region, picture a peaceful evening beside calm water. The sky fading slowly into darkness, fires glowing softly, voices low and steady, the land resting around them, vast and patient. This was life before disruption, before ownership replaced belonging, before urgency entered the land, a world shaped by balance, memory, and restraint, carried forward quietly through generations, ready, without knowing it, to face the arrival of distant sails and unfamiliar intentions that would one day appear along the horizon, bringing change to a land that had known only patience and time. Number 3. Spanish exploration and the first European presence as indigenous life along the Gulf Coast continued in its steady and balanced rhythm. The wider world beyond the horizon began to shift in quiet but significant ways. These changes were not felt immediately on the land that would one day become Houston. The forest still breathed slowly. The bayous still moved with patient curves. The The seasons still arrived and departed without interruption. Yet far across the ocean, curiosity about distant lands was growing, carried by stories, maps, and imagination, rather than understanding. The first European presence near this region did not arrive with certainty or confidence. It came cautiously, guided by incomplete knowledge and fragile vessels moving across vast and unpredictable waters. Ships followed coastlines rather than penetrating inland, observing from a distance rather than entering deeply. From the sea, the land appeared wide, green, and quiet, stretching inland without visible end. Early explorers were not searching for settlement at first. They were searching for routes, for opportunity, for proof of possibility. The Gulf Coast was approached slowly, with care and hesitation. Storms, shallow waters, and shifting currents made navigation difficult. Rivers opened toward the sea, but they concealed their depths, winding inward through wetlands and dense growth. When Europeans first encountered this coastline, they did not immediately understand its complexity. They saw water and land blending together, unsure where one ended and the other began. Marshes, estuaries, and bayous resisted clear definition. Movement inland required knowledge they did not yet possess. Without guidance, progress remained limited. For indigenous communities, these early appearances were moments of observation rather than alarm. Ships appeared briefly, resting near the coast, then departed again. They did not immediately alter daily life. Fishing still followed seasonal rhythm. Hunting still followed memory and instinct. Preparation for storms and seasons mattered more than distant visitors. Early contact, when it occurred, was cautious and minimal. Communication relied on gesture, tone, and patience rather than shared language. Each side studied the other quietly. There was curiosity but also distance. These encounters did not yet carry the weight of permanence. They were moments, not transformations. European explorers often misunderstood what they saw. The absence of large stone structures or visible agriculture led them to assume the land was unused. They failed to recognize the subtle management practiced by indigenous peoples. The controlled movement, the seasonal use, the intentional rest. These misunderstandings shaped the reports sent back across the ocean. The land itself limited deeper exploration. Wetlands slowed movement. Insects, heat, and unpredictable weather challenged endurance. Rivers curved and split, refusing straight paths. Without indigenous knowledge, survival inland was difficult and often abandoned. As a result, early European presence remained mostly coastal and temporary. Spanish explorers were among the first Europeans to travel along the Gulf Coast. Their journeys were marked by uncertainty and restraint rather than conquest. They mapped shorelines, named features, and recorded impressions, but they did not establish lasting settlements in this region. The land resisted urgency. These early expeditions often returned with incomplete understanding. Maps remained vague. Interior regions remained unknown. The Houston area, dense with wetlands and slow-moving water, remained largely untouched by direct European movement for generations. For indigenous peoples, stories of these encounters entered oral tradition calmly. Outsiders were noted, remembered, and discussed, but not feared. Life continued according to long-established patterns. The land still guided movement. The seasons still shaped behavior. As years passed, repeated voyages increased awareness without intimacy. European presence came and went, leaving little trace. The land absorbed these brief interactions without disruption. The Gulf Coast remained dominated by natural rhythm rather than human intention. Motivations for exploration varied. Trade, territory, curiosity, but all were constrained by environment. The region demanded patience, something few explorers fully possessed. Without immediate reward or clear access, sustained presence was delayed. Time moved forward quietly. The land remained patient. Indigenous life remained central. European awareness grew slowly, fragment by fragment, without yet reshaping the land itself. As you imagine this moment, picture distant sails on the horizon, ships resting briefly near shore, dense green land stretching inward, silent and unmoved. indigenous communities continuing daily life nearby, unaffected by distant attention. This was not yet colonization, not yet settlement, not yet disruption. This was first awareness, a cautious glance across water, a brief meeting of worlds that did not yet understand one another. The land that would become Houston remained what it had always been, vast, quiet, and guided by water and time, as European curiosity touched its edges lightly, then withdrew again, leaving the deeper rhythms of the land undisturbed, waiting calmly for the next chapter to arrive. As European awareness of the Gulf Coast slowly increased, the land that would one day become Houston remained largely unchanged in its daily rhythm. The forests still stood thick and quiet. The bayous still curved gently through low ground, carrying water without urgency. Seasons continued their familiar pattern, arriving and departing with steady predictability. Whatever attention the outside world gave to this region, it arrived from far away and moved slowly. Spanish explorers returned to the Gulf Coast more than once, but always with caution. Their ships followed the shoreline, rarely pressing inland. The coast itself was difficult to read. Shallow waters shifted constantly. Storms arrived without warning. Rivers opened wide mouths toward the sea, but their interiors remained hidden behind dense growth and wetlands. The region did not offer immediate clarity or reward. There were no obvious cities to claim, no visible riches to extract quickly, no clear routes that promised easy movement. Everything here seemed to resist speed. The land asked for patience, knowledge, and restraint, qualities not easily carried across oceans. Spanish expeditions were shaped by distance as much as by intention. Supplies were limited. Communication with distant authorities was slow. Decisions were made far from the land itself, based on incomplete information. Each journey carried uncertainty, and each return brought more questions than answers. Attempts to move inland were often abandoned. Wet ground slowed travel. Dense vegetation blocked paths. Heat and insects drained strength. Rivers split into smaller channels, confusing navigation. Without indigenous guidance, movement beyond the coast became difficult and risky. As a result, Spanish presence remained light and temporary. For indigenous communities, this continued pattern of brief appearances reinforced an understanding that these outsiders were visitors rather than settlers. Ships came and went, encounters were limited. Life on land continued uninterrupted. Fishing followed the tides, hunting followed seasonal movement. Preparation for storms and winter mattered more than distant observers. Trade between indigenous peoples and Europeans remained minimal in this region during early periods. Unlike other parts of the Americas where trade networks developed quickly, the Houston area's environment slowed interaction. Distance between communities and coastal landing points made sustained exchange difficult. Spanish influence existed more in maps and names than in daily life. Coastlines were labeled. Rivers were sketched imperfectly. Reports described vast wetlands and slow-moving waters. Yet these descriptions lacked depth, shaped by brief observation rather than lived experience. The land itself continued to regulate presence. Floods arrived seasonally, reshaping ground. Bayous overflowed gently, spreading water across wide areas before retreating again. These movements confused outsiders but felt familiar to those who lived with them. Time passed quietly. Decades moved forward without dramatic change. While other regions experienced growing settlement and transformation, the Houston region remained mostly untouched. Its challenges discouraged permanence. Its subtlety resisted simplification. Spanish priorities shifted elsewhere. Regions that offered clearer resources, easier routes, or established settlements drew more attention. The Gulf Coast near present-day Houston remained on the edge of focus, acknowledged but not pursued deeply. Indigenous life continued to adapt naturally. Knowledge of the land deepened further. Seasonal camps shifted slightly as water patterns changed. Communities adjusted to climate variation without losing balance. Oral tradition carried memory forward. including stories of distant visitors who came and left again. These stories did not dominate identity. They existed as part of a larger understanding of the world, a world that was wide, connected, and unpredictable. Outsiders were noted but not centered. Silence remained a defining feature of the land. Even when ships anchored offshore, their presence did not overwhelm the environment. Once they departed, sound returned to wind, water, and wildlife. Night fell without artificial light. Stars remained clear above dark water and forest. The region's resistance to early settlement was not aggressive. It was quiet and consistent. It did not push people away violently. It simply required more patience than most were willing to give. As European empires competed elsewhere, the Houston area remained in a long pause. Awareness existed without occupation. Interest existed without commitment. The land waited without expectation. As you imagine this time, picture empty shorelines at dawn, mist rising from still water, dense green land stretching inward, no roads, no permanent structures, only movement guided by tide, season, and memory. This was a place known but not taken, seen but not shaped, recorded but not transformed. The Houston region remained a quiet space between histories, a land that resisted haste and required humility. And as time continued its slow, steady flow, this patience preserved the land's rhythm, allowing indigenous life to remain central, uninterrupted, and deeply rooted, as the outside world lingered at a distance, still unsure how or whether to enter. As time continued its quiet passage, the land surrounding the slow-moving bayous and coastal plains remained largely untouched by permanent European presence. While distant empires discussed maps and boundaries, the land itself followed only the rhythm of water, season, and light. Nothing here hurried toward change. Nothing announced the future. The Houston region rested in a long moment of stillness, existing between awareness and transformation. European knowledge of the area increased gradually, but it remained shallow. Reports spoke of wetlands, heat, insects, and waterways that resisted control. These descriptions discouraged urgency. The region was seen as difficult rather than promising. Where other lands offered immediate reward, this place required patience without guarantee. For Spanish authorities, priorities lay elsewhere. Regions with established settlements, mineral wealth, or clearer agricultural potential demanded attention. The Gulf Coast near present-day Houston remained peripheral, acknowledged but rarely pursued. Distance softened intention, time diluted focus. Ships continued to pass along the coast occasionally, appearing briefly before disappearing again beyond the horizon. Their presence never lingered long enough to disrupt the land's rhythm. Each arrival was temporary. Each departure restored silence. Indigenous communities continued to live according to deeply ingrained patterns. Knowledge of the land became even more refined as generations passed. Flood cycles were understood instinctively. High ground was known without maps. Seasonal movement followed memory rather than instruction. Life unfolded without reference to distant powers. Stories of outsiders became part of oral tradition, not as central figures, but as passing elements in a much larger world. They were noted, remembered, then placed gently aside. What mattered most remained close at hand: food, shelter, community, and balance. The bayous continued their slow conversation with the land. Water rose and fell without warning, yet always returned to familiar paths. Forests leaned inward toward the water, their roots anchoring soil and absorbing moisture. Wildlife followed patterns older than memory, adapting quietly to change. Fire occasionally passed through open areas, clearing old growth and allowing new life to emerge. Storms arrived from the Gulf, sometimes fierce, sometimes brief. Afterward, the land healed itself without assistance. Nothing here remained broken for long. European powers spoke of control, yet control never arrived. The land required too much understanding and offered too little certainty. Without sustained presence, influence remained abstract, lines on paper, names without substance. This absence of early settlement preserved something rare. While other regions experienced rapid transformation, the Houston area retained its natural rhythm. Indigenous culture remained uninterrupted. Ecosystems remained intact. Silence continued to shape daily experience. Time moved forward quietly. Decades blended together, marked more by storms and seasons than by political events. The land did not know it was being discussed elsewhere. It did not prepare for change. It simply continued. Eventually, distant interests would return with new intentions and different persistence. But for now, the region remained in a long breath between histories, a pause that allowed continuity to endure. As you imagine this closing moment of early European contact, picture empty shoreline beneath a soft sky, water reflecting light without disturbance, forests standing dense and patient beyond the coast, no footsteps, no roads, no permanent mark. This was the land before settlement, before borders took hold, before names carried weight, a place known from afar yet untouched in spirit, a region held together by patience rather than power, a quiet space where history waited without urgency. And as the years continued to pass, this stillness preserved the land's identity, carrying it gently forward toward the moment when outside forces would return, not briefly, not hesitantly, but with intention, bringing an end to this long pause and beginning a new chapter in the story of Houston's past. Number 4. Mexican Texas and the changing control of the region as time continued its gentle movement. The long quiet pause that had defined the land near the bayous and coastal plains slowly began to thin. The stillness did not disappear suddenly. It softened first. Subtle changes appeared at the edges of the land's long silence, carried not by nature, but by intention from far away. This was the beginning of a new phase, one that did not arrive loudly, but one that would not fade as easily as those before it. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, shifting powers and growing populations began to look more closely at the Gulf Coast. The land that would one day cradle Houston was no longer just a distant idea on a map. It became a place of possibility, difficult, uncertain, but present in conversation. What had once been overlooked began to feel relevant. The region itself had not changed. The bayous still moved slowly through low ground. Wetlands continued to expand and contract with rainfall and season. Forests remained dense, and the heat still lingered heavily in summer air. Insects hummed. Storms rolled in from the Gulf. The land remained patient, unaware that it was being reconsidered. Indigenous communities continued their lives with the same calm rhythm that had guided them for generations. They moved with the land, not against it. Knowledge of flood patterns, high ground, and seasonal change was deeply embedded in daily routine. The arrival of more frequent outsiders did not immediately interrupt this balance, but it began to introduce quiet uncertainty. As Spain's influence weakened and new powers began to press forward, Texas entered a period of transition. Control shifted slowly, often more in name than in practice. Authority remained distant, enforcement remained inconsistent. The land itself continued to dictate what was possible. When Mexico gained independence from Spain, the region entered yet another phase of redefinition. The land near the bayous became part of a young nation still forming its identity. Policies encouraged settlement, offering land to those willing to attempt life in a challenging environment. These invitations were written with optimism, but the reality on the ground demanded resilience. Early settlers who ventured into the region encountered a land that resisted simplicity. Clearing space took time. Flooding erased progress. Heat drained energy. Disease lingered in wetlands. What looked manageable on paper proved exhausting in practice. Many arrived with expectation. Some stayed. Others quietly retreated. Those who remained learned quickly that survival required adaptation. Structures were built with elevation in mind. Paths followed water rather than cutting across it. Life adjusted to the rhythm of storms and seasons. The land did not bend easily, but it allowed coexistence when approached with patience. Small settlements appeared gradually, often near waterways that offered transport and resources. These were not cities. They were fragile beginnings, collections of structures surrounded by vast, untamed space. Supplies were limited. Communication with distant authorities remained slow. Isolation shaped daily experience. Indigenous presence did not vanish with settlement. Interaction increased, sometimes cooperative, sometimes strained. Trade occurred. Knowledge was exchanged, though not always valued equally. Misunderstanding grew alongside proximity. Balance became harder to maintain as outside expectations pressed inward. The land itself became the central challenge. Floodwaters reshaped ground without warning. Bayous overflowed quietly, then withdrew, leaving altered terrain behind. Roads washed away, fields struggled. Yet the soil, once understood, offered fertility and promise. What the land demanded in patience, it offered back in potential. As settlement increased slowly, the idea of permanence began to take hold. People started to imagine staying rather than passing through. This shift in intention marked a significant change. The land had always hosted movement. Now it began to feel the weight of plans. Still, growth remained limited. Houston did not yet exist. There was no central point, no organized expansion. The region existed in fragments, attempts scattered across a demanding landscape. Success depended less on ambition and more on endurance. Political uncertainty continued to shape life. Texas moved through periods of instability, shifting between identities and allegiances. For those living near the bayous, these changes felt distant. What mattered more was whether the river rose, whether supplies arrived, whether illness passed through. Time moved forward slowly, marked by seasons rather than milestones. Years blended together. Settlements appeared and disappeared. Some endured quietly, learning how to exist without fighting the land. The future city of Houston remained only an unformed possibility, resting quietly within this complex landscape. Nothing yet suggested scale or significance. The land was still dominant. Water still ruled movement. Silence still filled the spaces between human effort. As you imagine this stage, picture scattered homesteads resting beside slow-moving water, smoke rising gently into humid air, forests standing close, not yet pushed back, storm clouds forming and dissolving without urgency, the land wide and patient around small human presence. This was the end of complete silence, but not yet the beginning of a city. It was a time of adjustment, of learning limits, of quiet persistence. The land had begun to feel footsteps more frequently, but it still moved at its own pace. And as these early efforts continued, the conditions were slowly being set for something more focused, more intentional, an idea that would soon gather around one place, one plan and one name. That moment was approaching, but for now, the land still breathed slowly, holding its balance, as history prepared to take its next careful step forward. As the years continued to move forward, the land near the winding bayous began to feel a slightly different kind of presence. It was still quiet, still slow. But human intention had grown steadier. What had once been scattered effort began to gather direction, and that direction followed water. The bayous, which had always shaped the land, now began to shape human plans as well. Buffalo Bayou, moving gently through the low plains, offered something rare in this difficult environment, a natural route inward from the coast. Its waters were calm enough for travel, yet deep enough to imagine connection beyond isolation. Slowly, attention narrowed toward this waterway. Settlers who remained in the region learned to observe rather than rush. They noticed how floodwaters behaved, which ground stayed dry, and where trees grew strongest. They learned that success here depended not on force, but on timing. Building happened after watching. Movement followed patience. Supplies arrived slowly, often months apart. Tools were reused. Structures were repaired rather than replaced. Life remained fragile, but it was no longer temporary. People began to stay through seasons rather than passing through them. This quiet decision to remain changed everything. As trade increased along the Gulf Coast, the importance of inland access became clearer. Ports closer to the shore faced storms and shifting tides. The bayou offered protection. It allowed goods to move without facing the full force of the open sea. This advantage did not go unnoticed. The idea of founding a town began not as a certainty but as a possibility. Discussions happened quietly. Plans were tentative. The land had taught everyone caution. Nothing here rewarded impatience. When the Allen brothers eventually arrived, they did not see an empty wilderness. They saw a landscape already shaped by water, weather, and survival. Their vision was bold, but it rested on careful observation. They chose a location not because it was easy, but because it offered connection between river and land, coast and interior. The site that would become Houston was not ideal by traditional standards. It was humid, flood-prone, thick with vegetation. But it was positioned, and in this land, position mattered more than comfort. Early construction was modest. There were no grand buildings, no wide streets, no sense of permanence yet. Structures rose slowly, often elevated to avoid water. Paths followed natural contours rather than imposed design. The town did not challenge the land. It negotiated with it. Life in these early days required constant adjustment. Heavy rains could undo weeks of work overnight. Illness spread easily in warm, wet conditions. Supplies were unreliable, yet people stayed. They adapted routines. They learned when to work and when to wait. The settlement grew not through speed, but through repetition, one building at a time, one family at a time. Each addition tested whether the land would allow it to remain. Some efforts failed, others endured quietly. Houston was not yet a city. It was an experiment, fragile, uncertain, and shaped by persistence rather than confidence. The surrounding land remained vast and dominant. Forests pressed close. Wildlife moved freely near human space. At night, darkness returned fully, broken only by small points of firelight. Silence still held power here. Political uncertainty continued to hover. Texas itself was in flux, moving toward greater conflict and change. For those in the growing settlement, these tensions felt distant but unavoidable. Rumors traveled faster than supplies. News arrived incomplete, yet daily life continued. People woke, worked, rested, and prepared for the next storm, the next season, the next challenge. The land allowed no distractions from reality. Houston's earliest identity began forming quietly, not as a place of beauty or ease, but as a place of endurance. And that identity would soon be tested. As the years continued to pass, Houston slowly began to recognize itself not just as a settlement that survived, but as a place that could endure. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, shaped by repetition, by storms survived, by floods endured, by setbacks followed quietly by rebuilding. Confidence here was never loud. It grew softly, almost unnoticed. The town's relationship with Buffalo Bayou deepened. What had once been viewed mainly as a challenge slowly revealed itself as an asset. Boats arrived more regularly, carrying goods inland and outward toward the Gulf. Each journey reinforced the idea that Houston's future was tied not to roads or walls, but to water and movement. Merchants began to establish themselves more permanently. Warehouses appeared near the bayou's edge. Docks were improved, though still simple. Trade routes stabilized. Goods flowed in modest but reliable patterns. This consistency mattered more than scale. It allowed trust to form. The surrounding land continued to resist easy control. Floodwaters still reshaped ground without warning. Heat still slowed labor. Disease still lingered in humid seasons. Yet people adapted routines rather than abandoning effort. Elevated structures became more common. Drainage was improved slowly. Knowledge of the land grew deeper. Houston's population increased gradually, drawing people who were willing to accept uncertainty in exchange for opportunity. New arrivals learned quickly that this was not a place of immediate reward. It demanded patience, resilience, and attention. Those who stayed often did so because they understood this reality. Despite growth, the town remained quiet compared to older cities. There were no grand avenues, no monumental architecture. Streets remained narrow and uneven. Buildings were functional rather than impressive. Life here focused on necessity, not display. Community bonds strengthened through shared hardship. Neighbors relied on one another during floods, illness, and scarcity. Cooperation became instinctive. Survival depended less on individual effort and more on collective response. This quiet reliance shaped Houston's early social character. Political structures became more visible, though still limited. Local governance existed, but authority remained practical rather than symbolic. Decisions were shaped by what could realistically be enforced rather than what looked orderly on paper. The land still had the final say. Houston's role within the region became clearer. It was not a cultural center or a military stronghold. It was a connector, a place where goods paused briefly before moving onward. This identity suited the land. It required movement rather than permanence, flexibility rather than rigidity. As cotton production increased across Texas, Houston's importance as a transport point grew. Bales moved through the bayou. Trade expanded. Wealth accumulated slowly, unevenly, without spectacle. The town changed not in appearance but in function. Yet even as commerce increased, daily life remained grounded. People rose early. Work followed daylight. Rest followed exhaustion. The rhythm of nature still guided human activity more than clocks or schedules. The land had not surrendered its influence. Nights remained dark and quiet. Lamps glowed softly. Sounds faded quickly after sunset. The surrounding wilderness pressed close, reminding everyone that Houston was still small within a vast environment. This balance between growth and restraint defined the town's character. It expanded without ambition to dominate. It adapted rather than imposed, and in doing so, it laid a foundation that would support far greater change in the future. Number 5. The founding of Houston and early American settlement. Long before Houston became a vast and busy city, it existed only as an idea shaped by geography, timing, and quiet ambition. The land where Houston would rise was not chosen for beauty or comfort. It was chosen because it offered possibility. Dense forests, low-lying wetlands, and winding waterways defined the area. The climate was heavy with heat and humidity, and the land flooded easily. Yet beneath these challenges lay opportunity for those willing to adapt. In the early 19th century, this region of Texas was still forming its identity. Control over the land had shifted multiple times, and uncertainty was a constant presence. Yet this uncertainty also created space for new beginnings. American settlers arriving in Texas were drawn not by ease, but by potential. They came with the understanding that success here would require patience rather than speed. The founding of Houston began not as a grand plan, but as a calculated decision. Two brothers, Augustus and John Allen, recognized the strategic value of Buffalo Bayou. This slow-moving waterway connected inland territory to the Gulf of Mexico. While it was not always predictable, it offered access, something rare and valuable, in a region where overland travel was slow and difficult. In 1836, shortly after Texas gained independence, the Allen brothers purchased land along the bayou. The area was largely undeveloped, surrounded by forest and marsh. There were no streets, no permanent structures, and no guarantee that people would come. Yet the brothers believed that Houston's location would eventually outweigh its hardships. Early settlement was quiet and uncertain. A few buildings appeared near the water's edge, built quickly and simply. Wooden structures stood on uneven ground, often raised slightly to avoid flooding. Streets were planned but not yet formed. Paths developed naturally as people moved between homes, storage areas, and the bayou. Life for early settlers was demanding. Heat shaped daily routine. Work began early and ended when exhaustion arrived rather than at a set hour. Floods were common, sometimes washing away weeks of effort overnight. Disease spread easily in the warm, damp environment. Yet those who remained learned quickly. They adapted structures, adjusted schedules, and shared knowledge. Houston did not grow because it was comfortable. It grew because it functioned. The bayou allowed goods to move in and out. Lumber, cotton, and supplies passed through quietly. Small businesses formed near the water. Warehouses appeared, trade routes stabilized. Slowly, confidence grew. Population increased gradually. New settlers arrived knowing little about what awaited them. Some left quickly, overwhelmed by the conditions. Others stayed, drawn by the promise of opportunity rather than immediate reward. These settlers formed the core of early Houston society, resilient, adaptable, and practical. There was little separation between public and private life. Neighbors relied on one another for survival. During floods, people helped rebuild without expectation of return. During illness, care was shared. Community formed not through celebration but through shared hardship. Houston's early identity was shaped by this quiet cooperation. It was not a place of elegance or tradition. It was a place of function. Buildings were erected to serve needs, not to impress. Governance focused on practicality. Rules existed to maintain order, but flexibility remained essential. Despite challenges, optimism persisted. Each successful shipment through the bayou reinforced belief in the town's future. Each new arrival suggested that Houston's story was only beginning. The land remained difficult, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt demanding, and demand created purpose. As years passed, Houston began to solidify its role as a commercial center. Its growth remained modest but steady. It did not rush toward expansion. It allowed itself to grow at a pace the land permitted. This patience became part of its foundation. Nights in early Houston were quiet. Without electricity, darkness settled fully. Lamps glowed softly in windows. Sounds faded quickly after sunset. The surrounding wilderness remained close, reminding settlers that the town was still small within a vast landscape. Yet even in this quiet, there was movement. Ideas traveled, plans formed. The sense of permanence slowly replaced uncertainty. Houston was no longer just a hopeful experiment. It was becoming a place people believed in. The founding of Houston was not marked by dramatic moments or grand declarations. It was shaped instead by consistency, by showing up each day, rebuilding after setbacks, and trusting that adaptation would lead to stability. This approach allowed Houston to endure where others faded. As Houston continued to take its first careful steps forward, daily life slowly settled into a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than design. There was no sense of elegance in these early years, only practicality. Every structure, every routine, every decision was guided by one simple question: would it help people remain here a little longer? The land itself remained the strongest influence on life. Heavy rain still arrived without warning, turning roads into mud and swelling Buffalo Bayou beyond its banks. Flooding was not an occasional disaster but a regular reality. Instead of resisting it, settlers learned to expect it. Buildings were raised higher, goods were stored carefully. Movement slowed when water rose and resumed when it receded. Houston's earliest streets were more ideas than realities. Paths formed naturally where people walked most often, winding around trees, low ground, and standing water. These paths eventually became roads, not because they were planned, but because they were used repeatedly. The town grew organically, shaped by habit rather than blueprint. Commerce became the quiet engine of survival. Small trading operations developed near the bayou, where goods could arrive and depart by boat. Lumber from nearby forests, cotton from surrounding farms, and supplies from the coast passed through Houston steadily. If modestly, there was no sudden boom, only consistency, and consistency brought confidence. Merchants learned quickly that patience mattered more than speed. Delays were common. Boats arrived late, weather interrupted schedules, yet trade continued because there were few alternatives. Houston's value lay in its location, imperfect though it was. The bayou connected inland Texas to the wider world, and that connection mattered deeply. As settlement increased, so did diversity among the population. People arrived from different parts of the United States, each bringing expectations shaped by other regions. Many were unprepared for the climate and landscape. Some stayed only briefly, overwhelmed by heat, disease, and uncertainty. Others adapted, learning that survival here required humility rather than control. Disease was a constant presence in early Houston. Mosquitoes thrived in standing water, and medical knowledge was limited. Illness spread quickly during warm seasons. These realities forced settlers to depend on one another. Care was shared. Knowledge about survival circulated informally. Community bonds deepened through shared vulnerability. Despite hardship, optimism persisted. Each successful season strengthened belief in Houston's future. The town was small, but it endured. Where other settlements faded or failed, Houston remained. This persistence attracted attention. More people arrived not because life was easy, but because endurance suggested possibility. Social life remained simple. Gatherings were modest, often centered around work or shared meals rather than celebration. Conversation was practical. News traveled slowly. Evenings were quiet, marked by rest rather than entertainment. Darkness arrived fully after sunset, bringing stillness that settled over the town. Religion and personal belief offered comfort to many settlers, though formal institutions developed slowly. Early worship often took place in homes or shared spaces, shaped by availability rather than structure. Faith, like everything else in Houston, adapted to circumstance. Local governance emerged gradually. Rules focused on order and cooperation rather than control. Authority remained practical and flexible. Enforcement depended more on shared understanding than formal systems. In a place where survival required cooperation, rigid hierarchy held little value. Houston's relationship with the surrounding countryside grew stronger. Farmers depended on the town for trade. The town depended on farms for supply. This interdependence reinforced Houston's role as a connector rather than a destination. It was a place things passed through, a pause in movement rather than an endpoint. As the town stabilized, small improvements appeared. Docks were reinforced. Storage areas expanded. Homes became more durable. Yet nothing happened quickly. Progress here was incremental, shaped by repetition rather than vision. The environment continued to test resilience. Heat slowed labor. Storms disrupted plans. Yet each challenge refined understanding. Settlers learned where to build, when to move, and how to wait. The land did not become easier, but people became wiser. Houston's early American settlement was defined by adaptation rather than ambition. Growth came not from grand dreams, but from daily persistence. Those who stayed did so because they learned to live with uncertainty, not eliminate it. Nights remained calm and quiet. Without artificial light, the sky opened wide. Stars reflected faintly in the bayou. Sounds faded into darkness. The town rested, gathering strength for the next day. This quiet endurance formed the foundation of Houston's future. Long before industry or expansion, the town learned how to survive, and survival, repeated patiently, became stability. As Houston moved further into its early years of American settlement, a quiet sense of permanence began to take shape. This feeling did not arrive through ceremony or declaration. It formed slowly through repetition, through seasons that came and went, through challenges faced more than once, and through the simple realization that people were no longer just passing through, they were staying. Homes that had once been temporary became more solid. Wooden structures were reinforced, repaired rather than replaced. Foundations were raised slightly higher, shaped by lessons learned from repeated flooding. Settlers no longer built with the expectation of leaving soon. They built with the hope of remaining. Daily routines settled into familiarity. Morning began early, guided by daylight and temperature rather than clocks. Work followed the needs of the land and the movement of goods. Rest arrived naturally when exhaustion did. Life did not hurry, and it did not pause. It flowed steadily, shaped by environment and habit. Number 6. Growth trade, and the rise of a port city, Houston's population continued to grow at a measured pace. New arrivals came with mixed expectations. Some imagined opportunity without hardship. Others arrived already prepared for difficulty. Those who adapted stayed. Those who resisted often moved on. Over time, this process shaped a population that understood the land rather than fought it. The bayou remained central to Houston's identity. Its presence influenced everything, from trade and transport to settlement patterns. Floods continued, but they no longer surprised. They were anticipated, planned for, and endured. The bayou was no longer seen only as a threat. It was understood as a partner that required respect. Trade increased steadily. Cotton, timber, and agricultural goods passed through the town more regularly. Warehouses expanded. Merchants established longer-term operations. Money circulated slowly, cautiously. Wealth accumulated unevenly, without spectacle. Houston did not yet appear prosperous, but it was becoming reliable. This reliability mattered. It attracted businesses that valued consistency over speed. It encouraged farmers to depend on Houston as a market. It strengthened the town's role as a connector between inland production and coastal trade. Houston's importance grew not because it was impressive, but because it worked. Social life deepened quietly. Neighbors knew one another not through formal introduction, but through shared experience. Help was offered without negotiation. During illness or disaster, response was immediate and collective. Community formed not through identity, but through necessity. Education developed slowly. Early instruction often took place in homes or small shared spaces. Knowledge passed informally, shaped by practicality rather than structure. Literacy mattered, but survival mattered more. Learning focused on skills that supported daily life. Religion continued to offer comfort, though formal institutions remained modest. Worship adapted to circumstance, taking place wherever space allowed. Faith existed less as doctrine and more as reassurance, a way to make sense of hardship and persistence. Local governance gained clarity over time. Rules became more consistent. Authority remained practical. Decisions reflected lived reality rather than distant ideals. Law here did not aim to control nature. It aimed to organize human response to it. Despite growing stability, Houston remained small and quiet. Streets were still uneven. Buildings were still modest. The surrounding wilderness remained close, pressing in from all sides. The town existed as an island of human effort within a vast natural environment. This closeness to nature shaped character. Settlers understood that control was limited. Plans could be disrupted by weather or illness. Flexibility became a skill as valuable as strength. Those who learned to adjust thrived. As years passed, Houston began to imagine a future beyond survival. Not a grand future, but a continued one. People began to plan not just for the next season, but for years ahead. Children were raised with the expectation of staying. Land was tended with continuity in mind, yet ambition remained restrained. Houston did not rush toward expansion. It allowed itself to grow at a pace that matched its environment. This restraint prevented collapse. It allowed systems to develop slowly, tested by repetition. Nights remained calm. Without noise or artificial light, darkness settled deeply. The town rested fully. Sounds faded quickly, leaving only wind, water, and distant movement. Sleep came easily after long days of labor. In this stillness, Houston gathered strength, not through rest alone, but through continuity. Each day built upon the last. Each challenge refined understanding. The town became something stable not by avoiding difficulty, but by absorbing it. Houston's true transformation began quietly, at a moment when the city slowly lifted its attention from the land beneath its feet and turned it toward the water nearby. This shift did not happen suddenly, nor was it driven by urgency. It unfolded over many years, shaped by a growing understanding that connection to the wider world would determine the city's future. And for Houston, water offered the most natural and gentle path outward. Buffalo Bayou, once little more than a narrow and winding waterway, gradually became the lifeline of the growing settlement. Navigating it was never easy. Mud gathered along its banks, channels narrowed unexpectedly, and changing weather often slowed movement. Yet Houston learned patience early. Progress here did not come through speed, but through steady effort repeated again and again. As trade slowly took root, its influence became visible in everyday life. Simple wooden warehouses appeared near the water, later replaced by stronger and more permanent structures. Cotton, lumber, grain, and other goods began moving through the city, carried by boats and wagons alike. Houston was no longer just a place to live. It became a place where goods passed through, and where movement itself became part of daily rhythm. Railroads soon joined the waterways, forming a quiet partnership that reshaped the city's role in the region. Rail lines brought goods into Houston, and from there, the bayou carried them onward. This connection created momentum without noise. There was no sudden explosion of growth, only a steady increase in activity that felt natural rather than forced. The idea of Houston as a port city began as a distant vision rather than a clear plan. People understood that if the city were to grow, it needed deeper access to the sea. Turning that vision into reality required time, labor, and coordination. Channels needed to be widened and deepened. Resources had to be gathered. Decisions had to be made carefully, knowing that mistakes would carry long-term consequences. Merchants, laborers, and civic leaders slowly aligned around this shared goal. There was little drama in this process. Most of the work happened quietly, day after day. Early mornings blended into long afternoons, and progress measured itself not in headlines, but in inches of deeper water and stronger infrastructure. As the city leaned into its role as a center of trade, its atmosphere began to change. Streets grew busier, warehouses echoed with activity. Near the water, lights remained on later into the evening as ships arrived and departed. Houston was learning to blend rest with motion, silence with industry. Becoming a port city also meant becoming a meeting place. People arrived from different regions, drawn by work, opportunity, or simple curiosity. Some stayed for years, others only briefly. Houston absorbed them all quietly. It did not demand conformity or announce itself loudly. It simply made room. Despite its growth, Houston never fully surrendered to chaos. It resisted becoming overly crowded or hurried. Decisions were made slowly. Expansion happened cautiously. The city grew not by chasing comparison with older ports, but by trusting its own pace. As port activity increased, new industries followed. Oil, already present beneath the land, gained greater attention. Storage facilities, refineries, and transport networks developed gradually. Trade became more than exchange. It became a system, layered and interconnected, moving with quiet efficiency. Work patterns shifted as well. Neighborhoods formed near industrial areas. Daily life took on a steady rhythm. Mornings for labor, evenings for rest, nights for stillness. Even as activity increased, the city preserved a sense of calm, especially beyond the docks. Being a port city brought responsibility as much as opportunity. Houston faced storms, flooding, and unpredictable water levels. Each challenge left lessons behind. The city adapted not by resisting nature, but by learning from it, adjusting structures and expectations over time. Eventually, the port became more than infrastructure. It became part of Houston's identity. The city's name began to evoke images of water, movement, and connection. This reputation was earned slowly, shaped by persistence rather than ambition. Yet everyday life continued alongside all of this change. Children went to school. Markets opened and closed. In many neighborhoods, nights remained quiet and dark. While the port stayed active, much of the city rested peacefully, maintaining balance between work and stillness. This era marked more than economic growth. It marked understanding. Houston realized it was not only a city rooted in land, but also one carried by water, a city whose strength came from patience, whose progress unfolded gently, and whose future remained open rather than fixed. As you listen and begin to drift deeper into rest, imagine Houston rising in the same quiet way. Ship by ship, load by load, dream by dream, no urgency, no rush, only time doing what it always does best, moving forward steadily. As Houston continued to grow into its role as a port city, the change did not arrive with noise or sudden transformation. Instead, it settled gently into the city's daily rhythm, becoming part of ordinary life in ways that were easy to miss if one was not paying attention. Progress here was rarely dramatic. It was steady, patient, and deeply connected to repetition. Each day, the movement of goods became more familiar. Barges traveled the bayou with increasing regularity, carrying cotton, lumber, grain, and later oil-related materials. Dock workers learned the rhythm of loading and unloading, their work shaped by tide, weather, and daylight. There was no rush to finish quickly. The work followed a pace that could be sustained day after day. Warehouses multiplied along the water's edge, first small and simple, then larger and more permanent. These structures did not dominate the skyline. They blended into the environment, functional and quiet, designed for use rather than display. Over time, they became landmarks of reliability rather than ambition. The railroad strengthened Houston's growing identity as a connector. Trains arrived from inland regions carrying goods that would eventually move outward toward the coast and beyond. The sound of locomotives became familiar, part of the background rather than an interruption. Tracks stretched outward like calm lines of connection, linking Houston to distant places without pulling it away from itself. Merchants and traders settled into routines shaped by trust and predictability. Deals were made slowly, often face-to-face. Relationships mattered as much as profit. A reputation for reliability became one of Houston's quiet strengths. Those who worked here learned that consistency mattered more than speed. As trade increased, the city began to attract people whose lives revolved around movement and exchange. Shipbuilders, engineers, clerks, and laborers found places within the growing system. Neighborhoods formed gradually, often near places of work. These communities developed their own calm rhythms, shaped by early mornings and restful evenings. Despite increasing activity, Houston resisted becoming overwhelming. Streets remained navigable. Crowds gathered near docks during busy hours, then dispersed naturally. Beyond the port areas, much of the city retained its quiet character. Homes remained spaced apart. Nights stayed dark and calm. The bayou itself continued to shape the city's limits. Flooding still occurred, reminding Houston that progress required humility. Instead of resisting these challenges, the city adjusted. Infrastructure improved slowly. Drainage systems expanded. Planning became more thoughtful, guided by experience rather than optimism alone. The idea of a deep water port moved from vision toward reality through careful persistence. Channels were dredged little by little. Funding was gathered gradually. Each improvement felt small on its own, but together they created lasting change. The work demanded patience, and Houston provided it. With deeper access to the sea, Houston's reach expanded. Ships from farther regions began to arrive. Goods moved outward with greater ease. The city became part of larger trade networks without losing its local identity. It connected outward while remaining grounded. Economic growth followed this expansion, but it remained uneven and measured. Wealth accumulated slowly. There were no sudden booms that overwhelmed the city's structure. Instead, opportunity spread gradually, allowing systems to adapt rather than collapse under pressure. Oil, increasingly important beneath the land, began to influence trade more strongly. Storage tanks appeared near waterways. Transport systems adapted to handle new materials. Yet even as this industry grew, it did not immediately dominate the city's character. Houston remained balanced, absorbing change rather than being defined by it. Daily life continued alongside this growth without disruption. Markets opened in the morning and closed at dusk. Families gathered in the evenings. Schools and churches provided routine and reassurance. The city expanded, but it did not abandon its sense of calm. Houston's port identity brought new awareness of the wider world. News arrived with ships, stories traveled with travelers. Yet this awareness did not create restlessness. Instead, it added quiet depth. The city understood itself as part of something larger without feeling pressure to compete or hurry. Storms and challenges continued to test the city's resilience. Each difficulty left behind lessons rather than scars. Infrastructure improved, planning matured. Houston learned that endurance mattered more than perfection. Over time, the port became not just a place of work, but a symbol of connection. It represented patience rewarded by persistence. It reflected a city willing to grow slowly, to listen to its environment, and to move forward without urgency. As you continue listening, imagine the steady movement of water against docks, the soft echo of work completed at day's end, and the quiet confidence of a city finding its place in the world. Houston did not rise suddenly. It grew the way rivers flow, steadily, naturally, and without needing attention. As Houston continued to settle into its identity as a port city, a quiet confidence began to emerge. It was not the confidence of spectacle or speed, but the confidence that comes from systems working as intended. The city no longer questioned whether it belonged among centers of trade. It simply continued doing the work that proved it did. The port became more organized over time, though never rushed. Schedules grew more predictable. Ship arrivals followed patterns shaped by tide, weather, and season. Workers learned to read the water as carefully as they read documents. Every movement carried awareness, built from experience rather than instruction. With each passing year, Houston's connection to distant markets deepened. Goods moved not only outward, but inward as well. Materials from faraway places arrived quietly, folded into local life without fanfare. The city became a place where the wider world passed through gently, leaving traces rather than disruption. This growing connection influenced culture in subtle ways. Accents blended. Ideas arrived slowly, carried by travelers and trade rather than trends. Houston absorbed these influences without losing its grounded nature. Change here was additive, not replacing what already existed. Industry expanded, but it did so carefully. Facilities grew near the port, shaped by practical needs rather than ambition. The hum of machinery became part of the city's background, steady and low. It did not overpower daily life. Instead, it marked progress without urgency. The presence of water continued to demand respect. Floods still came, reminding the city that growth required adaptation. Each challenge refined understanding. Engineers and planners adjusted designs. Communities learned which areas required patience and which demanded change. Houston's resilience grew through listening rather than resisting. Neighborhoods evolved alongside the port. Some grew busier, shaped by work schedules and movement. Others remained quiet, protected by distance from industrial activity. This balance allowed the city to expand without becoming overwhelming. Rest and labor existed side by side. Nightfall still brought calm. Beyond the docks, lights dimmed early. Streets emptied gradually. The city rested deeply, gathering energy for the next day. Even near the port, activity slowed after dusk, allowing silence to return. The port's influence extended beyond economics. It shaped how Houston understood itself. The city began to see value in patience, in infrastructure built to last rather than impress. Success was measured not by rapid expansion, but by continuity. Generations grew up knowing the port as part of the city's natural rhythm. For them, ships arriving and departing felt as ordinary as seasons changing. This familiarity removed fear and replaced it with quiet pride. Houston did not try to rival older port cities. It did not compare itself loudly. Instead, it trusted its path. Its growth was grounded in geography, effort, and time. That trust allowed stability to form. As decades passed, the port became inseparable from Houston's identity, yet it never overshadowed the city's humanity. Life here remains centered on people, routines, and shared experience, rather than industry alone. The city learned that growth did not require constant motion. Pauses mattered. Reflection mattered. Houston moved forward without exhausting itself, preserving space for rest even as opportunity expanded. As you listen now, imagine the water moving gently against the shore, ships resting quietly at dock, workers returning home after long but unhurried days, the city breathing evenly, awake but at peace. Houston's rise as a port city was not a moment, it was a process. A slow unfolding shaped by patience, resilience, and respect for the land and water that made it possible. And as time continued forward, the city carried this lesson with it, that lasting strength comes not from rushing toward the future, but from allowing it to arrive naturally.
Number 7. Oil, industry, and transformation.
In the early 20th century, at the dawn of the 20th century, Houston rested in a moment of quiet anticipation. The city had already established itself as a place shaped by water, trade, and steady movement, but it had not yet stepped fully into the industrial identity that would later define it. Life moved calmly along the bayous and rail lines, guided by routine rather than ambition. People worked, rested, and gathered in patterns shaped more by habit than by expectation of sudden change. Beneath the land itself, however, a force waited silently. Oil, long hidden deep underground, was present long before it became known. It did not announce itself with urgency. It remained still, patient, and unseen, much like the transformation it would eventually bring. When early discoveries occurred in Texas, they were noticed with curiosity rather than certainty. Houston, careful by nature, did not rush forward. It observed. The city had learned restraint through experience. Floods, failed ventures, and slow recoveries had shaped its character. Growth here had always been earned gradually. As news of oil discoveries spread across the region, Houston listened carefully. It did not abandon its identity as a port city. Instead, it considered how this new resource might fit into the rhythm already established. Early oil activity near Houston began modestly. Small drilling operations appeared in surrounding areas, often far from the city's center. These efforts were experimental, cautious, and uncertain. Workers arrived quietly, bringing equipment and knowledge that felt unfamiliar but not disruptive. There was no sudden surge of population or noise. Life continued. As oil production increased, Houston's role became clearer. The city did not sit directly atop the largest oil fields, but it possessed something equally valuable: access. Railroads, waterways, and an expanding port made Houston a natural point of movement processing. Oil did not need to be extracted within the city to shape it. It needed only to pass through. Refineries began to appear on the outskirts, placed thoughtfully near transportation routes. These were not grand structures meant to impress. They were functional, practical, and designed to endure. Pipes, tanks, and machinery blended into the flat landscape, altering it quietly. The skyline changed, but slowly, without drama. Workers adapted to new routines. Shifts followed predictable schedules. The hum of machinery became part of the city's background sound, steady and low. Industry here did not roar. It breathed. There was repetition in the work, and comfort in that repetition. Days blended together, marked by labor and rest, rather than spectacle. Houston's economy responded gradually. Businesses expanded to support industry, supply companies, transport services, maintenance operations. Banks became more active, but still careful. Investment flowed with caution. The city remembered hardship and did not forget it easily. Growth was welcomed, but never blindly trusted. Neighborhoods near industrial areas evolved naturally. Housing appeared where workers needed it. Streets formed without rigid planning, shaped by necessity rather than vision. These communities developed identities rooted in daily life, shared work hours, shared challenges, shared rest. Despite industrial growth, Houston did not abandon balance. Residential areas remained quiet, especially at night. Churches, schools, and markets continued to anchor social life. Industry did not replace culture, it joined it. Environmental awareness emerged through experience rather than theory. Oil operations brought risks, fires, spills, and accidents. Houston responded by adjusting practices, improving safety, and learning from mistakes. Progress here was never separated from consequence. Transportation networks strengthened, roads were reinforced to carry heavier loads. Rail connections multiplied. The port expanded its capacity, welcoming oil products alongside traditional goods. Houston became a node in a growing global network, yet it did not lose its local character. As oil revenues increased, infrastructure improved. Public services expanded. Utilities became more reliable. These changes arrived quietly, often unnoticed day to day, yet they reshaped quality of life over time. Cultural influences blended seamlessly. Workers came from different parts of Texas and beyond, bringing accents, traditions, and customs. Houston absorbed them without resistance. Diversity here did not create division, it created layering. The city's relationship with nature remained central. Bayous still flooded, storms still arrived, heat still shaped daily routine. Oil and industry did not overpower these realities. Instead, they learned to work around them. By the second decade of the 20th century, Houston had begun to sense its transformation. It was no longer only a place of trade and movement. It was becoming a center of industry and energy. Yet this awareness did not bring urgency. Houston moved forward the way it always had, step by step. The city's identity evolved without losing memory. Older residents recognized familiar rhythms beneath new structures. Newcomers adapted to the pace rather than forcing change. Time here still moved gently. As you imagine this period, picture early morning light reflecting off metal tanks, workers arriving quietly, rail cars moving steadily, water flowing nearby, unchanged. A city growing not through speed, but through patience. Houston did not chase the future, it allowed the future to arrive. As the years moved deeper into the early 20th century, Houston continued to change in ways that felt gradual rather than dramatic. There were no sharp turning points that divided the past from the present. Instead, each day added something small, another shipment, another worker, another structure, until the accumulation itself became transformation. Oil refined Houston's sense of purpose. It gave the city a new kind of confidence, one rooted not in optimism but in reliability. Production followed schedules. Transport followed routes. Systems repeated themselves until they became familiar. This familiarity reduced uncertainty and allowed people to plan their lives with steadier expectations. Industrial zones expanded outward rather than inward. Houston did not crowd its center with factories. It allowed space. This separation preserved quiet residential areas and reinforced the city's balanced layout. Work existed where it belonged, and rest remained protected. Daily life adjusted subtly. Mornings began earlier for some. Nights grew quieter in others. The rhythm of the city stretched without snapping. People adapted without complaint, guided by necessity rather than pressure. Oil also brought a new kind of connection to the wider world. Houston became linked to distant places through energy networks, trade agreements, and shipping routes. Yet these connections felt abstract to most residents. What they noticed instead was steady jobs, improved roads, and growing neighborhoods. Education responded to industry's needs. Training programs appeared quietly, preparing workers for technical roles. Learning became practical, focused, and accessible. This investment strengthened the workforce without creating hierarchy. Skill mattered more than status. The city's leadership approached growth with caution. Decisions were deliberate. Expansion was evaluated. Houston resisted the temptation to rush into unchecked development. It had learned, through experience, that stability mattered more than speed. Environmental challenges continued to remind the city of its limits. Flooding required constant attention. Infrastructure had to adapt. Houston did not view nature as an obstacle to overcome, but as a factor to respect. Planning became more thoughtful, shaped by coexistence rather than domination. Cultural spaces remained central to community life. Music, gatherings, and shared meals offered continuity. Industry did not erase tradition. It existed alongside it, creating a layered identity rather than a single narrative. As oil revenues flowed more consistently, public investment increased, utilities improved, transportation became more reliable. These changes did not arrive with celebration. They arrived quietly, improving daily life without demanding attention. Houston's workforce grew more diverse. People arrived with different skills, backgrounds, and experiences. The city did not force assimilation, it allowed blending. Over time, this diversity became one of its strengths. The early 20th century also introduced moments of uncertainty. Markets shifted, prices fluctuated. Houston responded with adjustment rather than panic. It reduced risk by diversifying industry and maintaining flexibility. By the time the decade neared its close, Houston no longer questioned whether oil had changed it. The change was visible, yet it felt natural. The city had not been reshaped by force, it had been reshaped by patience. Old and new coexisted comfortably. Wooden homes stood near steel structures. Quiet streets bordered busy routes. Past and future shared space without conflict. As you imagine this continuing chapter, picture a city at dusk. Industrial lights glowing softly in the distance. Residential windows warm and calm. Water moving slowly through bayous. A sense of balance settling in. Houston was becoming something new without losing what it had been. As Houston moved further into the early 20th century, the presence of oil no longer felt new. It had become familiar, woven into the city's identity in quiet, steady ways. What once seemed like potential had settled into routine. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and in that transition, Houston found stability. Industrial processes refined themselves through repetition. Machinery improved not through radical redesign, but through careful adjustment. Workers learned efficiency through experience. Each task became smoother, quieter, and more predictable. This predictability reduced strain and allowed confidence to grow, not excitement, but trust. The city's physical shape continued to evolve gently. Roads stretched outward, rail yards expanded their reach. Storage facilities grew taller and wider, yet Houston did not crowd itself. Space remained an essential part of its character. Open land still existed between zones of activity, allowing the city to breathe. Economic confidence spread gradually. Families planned for the future with more certainty. Home ownership increased. Small businesses found consistent support from a growing workforce. Prosperity here did not arrive in waves. It accumulated slowly, like sediment carried by water. Oil also influenced how Houston was seen beyond its borders. Investors and planners began to view the city as dependable rather than speculative. This reputation attracted measured development rather than reckless expansion. Houston became known for follow-through. Despite growth, humility remained. The city remembered its vulnerability to storms and floods. Industry did not erase caution. Infrastructure planning increasingly considered environmental reality. Drainage systems improved, building practices adjusted. Houston learned through necessity rather than theory. Social life continued to revolve around shared spaces. Community events, local gatherings, and religious institutions provided continuity. People found comfort in familiarity. Industry did not replace human connection, it supported it indirectly by providing stability. Workplaces became communities of their own. Long hours shared together created bonds among workers. These relationships extended beyond factories and refineries into neighborhoods and families. Industry shaped not only economy, but social fabric. Education expanded its practical focus. Skills training, engineering knowledge, and technical understanding became more accessible. This did not create hierarchy. It created competence. Houston valued ability over status. As oil markets fluctuated, Houston demonstrated resilience. When demand softened, the city adjusted without collapse. When demand rose, it expanded without excess. This balance became instinctive. Cultural expression reflected the city's calm confidence. Music, food, and local traditions blended influences without losing cohesion. Houston did not seek a singular identity, it allowed multiplicity. By the end of the early 20th century's opening phase, Houston stood transformed yet recognizable. Oil and industry had altered its scale, its reach, and its connections, but not its temperament. The city remained measured, patient, and grounded. The transformation was not loud. It did not announce itself with celebration or spectacle. It unfolded quietly, one decision at a time, guided by experience rather than ambition. As you imagine the close of this chapter, picture Houston settling into evening, industrial work slowing, light softening, water reflecting faint glow, a city at rest after steady effort. This was Houston's early 20th century transformation, not a moment of sudden change, but a long, calm becoming. Number 8, modern expansion, space exploration, and cultural growth. As the 19th century slowly gave way to the 20th, Houston entered a period of quiet but determined change. The city was no longer a young settlement finding its footing, nor was it simply a regional trading hub shaped only by railroads and waterways. Instead, Houston began to move into a new rhythm, one defined by expansion, modern infrastructure, and a growing sense that its future would be larger than anyone had once imagined. This transformation did not happen suddenly. There were no sharp breaks between eras, no single moment when the old Houston disappeared and a new one appeared in its place. Instead, change arrived gradually, carried forward by population growth, technological progress, and the steady confidence of a city that had learned how to adapt. The streets became busier. Neighborhoods expanded outward from the original city center. Where once open land and quiet roads had dominated the landscape, new homes, businesses, and public buildings began to appear. Houston's growth was not tightly planned or neatly contained. It spread outward, following opportunity rather than order, creating a city defined by movement and possibility. Yet even as the city grew, it retained a certain calm persistence. Houston did not rush to imitate older American cities. It moved forward in its own way, shaped by space, climate, and a culture that valued practicality over tradition. One of the strongest forces behind Houston's modern expansion was transportation. Railroads had already connected the city to the wider region, but now roads, shipping routes, and later highways began to reshape how people and goods moved through the city. The port became increasingly important. Improvements to waterways and shipping access allowed Houston to strengthen its role as a gateway between inland America and the wider world. Goods flowed in and out steadily, supporting industries that relied on movement rather than location. This flexibility allowed Houston to grow without being confined by geography. Industries expanded alongside transportation. Manufacturing, refining, and distribution created jobs that attracted new residents. People arrived from rural Texas, from other southern states, and gradually from across the nation. Each arrival added another layer to Houston's growing identity. Neighborhoods formed around work, culture, and shared experience. Some areas grew dense and active, while others remained quiet and residential. This uneven development became a defining characteristic of the city. Houston was not built around a single center of life. It became a city of many centers, each connected loosely but never fully unified. This structure allowed the city to absorb growth without overwhelming itself. Expansion could happen outward rather than upward. Space remained available, reinforcing Houston's reputation as a city that did not feel confined. Houston's climate played a subtle but constant role in shaping modern life. Heat, humidity, and seasonal storms influenced architecture, daily routines, and even social habits. Buildings adapted with wide porches, ventilation, and later air conditioning. Streets and neighborhoods adjusted to the realities of rain and flooding. Rather than resisting the environment, Houston gradually learned how to live with it. Storms were expected. Heat was managed rather than avoided. This acceptance fostered resilience, allowing the city to continue expanding even when conditions were challenging. The relationship between the city and its environment remained complex. Growth brought pressure to low-lying areas and waterways, creating long-term challenges. Yet at the same time, Houston's willingness to adapt rather than retreat became one of its defining strengths. As Houston expanded physically, it also began to deepen culturally. Earlier generations had shaped the city through trade, industry, and survival. Now, as stability increased, space opened for expression, creativity, and shared identity. Music, food, and community traditions grew alongside population diversity. New residents brought their customs, languages, and histories, blending into a culture that was already flexible by nature. Houston did not demand uniformity. It allowed difference to exist side by side. Churches, social organizations, and local institutions became anchors of daily life. These spaces offered connection in a city that was rapidly spreading outward. They helped people feel grounded even as the landscape around them changed. Education also played a growing role. Schools expanded, universities strengthened, and learning became a pathway to opportunity. Knowledge and skill began to shape Houston's future as much as land and industry once had. By the early decades of the 20th century, Houston was no longer thinking of itself only as a regional center. Its industries connected it to national and international networks. Its port linked it to distant markets. Its population reflected movement from many places. This growing global awareness did not erase local identity. Instead, it layered new perspectives onto an existing foundation. Houston became a place where the local and the global coexisted quietly, without needing dramatic gestures or declarations. The city's pace remained steady rather than rushed. Growth continued, but it unfolded in stages. Each decade added something new without fully replacing what came before. As Houston continued to expand through the early decades of the 20th century, daily life within the city began to feel subtly different from what it had been before. The pace was still unhurried compared to older industrial cities, but there was a growing sense of forward motion. Mornings brought the sound of movement, trains passing, ships arriving at port, workers beginning their routines. Evenings settled gently, with neighborhoods quieting under warm skies and long shadows. The population continued to grow steadily. Families arrived looking for work, opportunity, or simply space to begin again. Some stayed close to the city center, while others moved outward, drawn by affordable land and the promise of room to breathe. This outward movement slowly reshaped Houston into a city defined by distance rather than density. Homes spread across wide areas connected by roads that stretched longer each year. Unlike cities that grew upward, Houston grew outward, allowing people to live with a sense of openness. This physical space influenced mindset. Life felt less confined, less hurried. Even as the city modernized, it retained an atmosphere of calm expansion rather than pressure. Industry continued to anchor much of this growth. Refineries, factories, and shipping-related businesses offered steady employment. These jobs did not arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly, creating stability rather than sudden transformation. This stability allowed communities to form organically, shaped by routine and familiarity. The port remained central to Houston's identity. Ships arrived carrying goods, raw materials, and ideas from distant places. The flow of trade reinforced Houston's connection to the wider world, even as daily life remained grounded in local experience. The city learned how to exist as both a working port and a growing home for thousands of families. Transportation within the city evolved as well. Roads improved, automobiles became more common, changing how people moved through space. Distance became less of an obstacle, allowing neighborhoods to spread farther apart without isolation. This mobility reinforced Houston's outward growth, encouraging development across a broad landscape. Despite modernization, there was little sense of urgency. Houston did not rush to define itself through grand monuments or rigid planning. Instead, it allowed change to happen incrementally. Each addition, whether a new neighborhood, a business district, or an industrial site, settled into place quietly. Cultural life continued to deepen alongside this physical growth. Music drifted through neighborhoods. Local traditions formed and reformed as people from different backgrounds lived side by side. Food became an expression of this blending, shaped by influences from across the region and beyond. These everyday details created a sense of belonging that did not rely on formal identity. Education and learning gained increasing importance. Schools expanded to meet the needs of a growing population. Universities began to play a larger role in shaping the city's future, offering knowledge and skills that extended beyond traditional industries. This emphasis on learning quietly prepared Houston for transformations that had not yet fully arrived. The city's relationship with nature remained close and sometimes challenging. Heavy rains, heat, and seasonal storms reminded residents that progress did not erase environmental reality. Instead of retreating, Houston adapted. Drainage systems improved, building practices adjusted. Resilience became part of the city's character, shaped by experience rather than theory. Houston's experience during this time reflected a broader national struggle. Reconstruction had ended, but the questions it raised remained unanswered. What did freedom truly mean? Who benefited from progress? How could a city grow while leaving so many behind? These questions did not find resolution quickly. Instead, they settled into the foundation of Houston's modern identity. The city learned to expand while holding contradiction, to develop while carrying history forward unresolved. As the 19th century came to a close, Houston stood changed but unfinished. Slavery was gone, yet its legacy remained. War had ended, yet its consequences continued. Reconstruction had promised renewal, but delivered partial transformation. What followed would be shaped by these years, by endurance, by restraint, by the quiet strength of those who survived and adapted. As you imagine the close of this chapter, picture a city moving forward slowly, streets familiar yet altered, people carrying memory quietly, the past not forgotten but folded into the present. This was not an ending of struggle, it was the shaping of endurance, a foundation laid not in peace but in persistence.